My sister mocked my allergy in front of guests, then handed me crab-laced soup. What she didn't see was a billionaire chief executive officer dialing 911 with an epinephrine pen already in hand. The air in the private dining room of Entitlement was thick with the scent of white truffles and the cloying, metallic tang of unbridled ambition. Amber light dripped from the crystal chandeliers, casting long, sharp shadows against the dark wood paneling. I adjusted my glasses, a small, practiced motion to center myself. I am Natalia Cole, a woman who lives in the quiet margins of history, a restorer of ancient books. I am more comfortable with the scent of centuries, old vellum, and the neutral acidity of preservation fluids than I am in a room full of designer suits and calculated smiles. To me, this party felt like a manuscript left in the sun, edges curling, turning brittle under the heat of 100 judgmental eyes. Sloane stood on the small podium at the front of the room, her teeth gleaming like polished ivory. She had just been named the Public Relations Director for Thorne Global, and she wore the title like a suit of armor. Her dress, a silk sheath that cost more than my monthly studio rent, shimmered every time she shifted her weight. She leaned into the microphone, her voice amplified and dripping with that theatrical, practiced exhaustion she saved for the public. "Natalia, don't make a scene," she said, her laughter rippling through the speakers. "It is just mushroom soup. There is no shellfish. Or do you want to ruin my promotion party with another one of your episodes?" A wave of uncomfortable, polite laughter rolled through the room. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, a sensation I had spent 26 years trying to neutralize. To Sloane, my life-threatening anaphylaxis was nothing more than a convenient plot point in her personal narrative, a way to paint me as the fragile, attention-seeking younger sister. She basked in their approval, her eyes never once meeting mine with anything resembling genuine concern. She was a master of optics, a weaver of illusions, and tonight, she was the queen of the ball. I looked down at the table. I was an outsider here, a flaw in the perfect composition of the evening. My parents, Alistair and Cordelia, sat to my left, beaming at their golden child. They were 60 years old and famously vain, their lives spent chasing the reflected glory of Sloane's high-velocity career. They dismissed my work as dusty and depressing, unable to see the surgeon, like precision required to save a document that survived the Great Fire of London. To them, I was the disappointing daughter who chose silence over the boardroom. But then, the air changed. Magnus Thorne, the group chairman and the man who had signed Sloane's promotion letters, was sitting directly across from me. He was 58 years old, with a face carved from granite and eyes that saw through every lie. He wasn't looking at Sloane. He was staring at my soup bowl with a look of absolute, cold horror. The room felt suddenly claustrophobic. The golden light seemed to dim as Magnus's chair scraped against the floor. He knew. He had lost his own daughter to the same silent killer that was currently hiding under a layer of earthy truffle oil in my bowl. While Sloane continued her monologue about brand identity and corporate synergy, the man at the head of the empire was already moving. He reached into the inner pocket of his $5,000 suit, his movements blurring with a speed that defied his age. I looked at the soup. A small, reddish, brown swirl of oil caught the light, shimmering like melted copper. It looked exactly like the mushroom extract Sloane had promised. But my nose, trained to detect the faint chemical signatures of mold and decay, caught something else. A whisper of the sea. A trace of something that did not belong in the forest. My heart began to drum against my ribs, a trapped bird sensing the shadow of the hawk. I looked up at my sister, and for one heartbeat, the PR mask slipped. Behind the gleaming teeth and the wide, innocent eyes, I saw the cold, hard logic of a predator. She wasn't just teasing me. She was testing the limits of my survival. She thought she could edit me out of her story, one spoonful at a time. The bowl sat before me like a dormant volcano, beautiful and deceptive. The steam rose in thin, elegant ribbons, carrying the heavy, musky scent of truffles and earth. I felt the weight of the room pressing in on me, the expectant stares of 50 people who saw only a sisterly gesture and a high-end appetizer. I wanted to believe the lie. For 26 years, I had survived on the crumbs of affection Sloane allowed me, convincing myself that beneath her polished exterior and sharp tongue, there was a core of shared history that would never let her truly hurt me. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the heavy silver spoon, the metal cool against my skin. Sloane leaned closer, her perfume a suffocating cloud of jasmine and chemicals. "You look so tense, Natalia," she whispered, her voice low enough that only our parents and I could hear. "I asked the chef to use his special crab fat oil as a base for yours. It is liquid gold, really. I thought it would be a nice change from that bland, restricted life you lead. Think of it as a celebratory gift." My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at my mother, who was busy adjusting her pearls, and my father, who was already halfway through a glass of vintage red wine. They were oblivious. Or perhaps they simply chose to be. I looked back at the soup. The reddish, brown swirls of oil caught the amber light, shimmering with a richness that felt almost predatory. I was a restorer. I knew how to identify the hidden layers of a canvas. The subtle shifts in chemistry that indicated forgery or decay. Every instinct in my body screamed that the smell was too complex, the umami too deep, the fishy undertone too distinct to be mere mushroom. But Sloane was watching me with an expression that combined a challenge with a mocking sort of pity. If I refused, I would be the dramatic one. I would be the daughter who ruined the most important night of Sloane's career because of a suspicious mind. I wanted so desperately to be normal, to be part of the family that sat around this table, that I suppressed the survival instinct that had kept me alive since my first reaction at age 6. I told myself that she would not risk it. Not here. Not in front of Magnus Thorne. I took the first spoonful. The taste was incredible. It was a violent explosion of savory flavors, the earthy truffle clashing with a rich, buttery sweetness that coated my tongue. For exactly 5 seconds, I felt a wave of relief. It was just soup. I was being paranoid. I looked at Sloane and saw her smile widen, but it did not reach her eyes. Her eyes remained fixed on my throat, watching with a terrifying, clinical focus. Then the heat started. It began as a tiny spark at the back of my tongue, a prickle that felt like a swarm of invisible needles. Within seconds, the spark became a wildfire. I tried to swallow, but the muscles in my esophagus felt like they were beamed by a cold, iron hand. The rich aftertaste of the crab oil turned into the taste of copper and terror. I looked at the table, the crystal glasses, the smiling faces, and they all began to blur. "Natalia?" my mother asked, her voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. "Is something wrong? You look a bit flushed." I tried to answer, but the air was already being rationed. My tongue was thickening, expanding until it felt like a foreign object in my mouth. I could feel the hives beginning to bloom across my chest and arms, hot and angry welts that pulsed with my accelerating heartbeat. The transition from safety to catastrophe was so swift it felt unreal. One moment I was a guest at a promotion party, and the next, I was a woman drowning on dry land. I reached out for my water glass, my fingers fumbling and weak, but I only succeeded in knocking it over. The water spilled across the white linen cloth, a transparent tide that mirrored the chaos unfolding in my lungs. Sloane did not move to help. She simply sat there, her hands folded neatly on her lap, watching the light fade from my eyes, with the satisfaction of an artist who had finally finished a difficult masterpiece. The deceptive warmth of the room had vanished, replaced by the freezing, absolute certainty that my sister had just tried to kill me. The velvet curtained my airway did not just fall, it slammed shut. I reached for my throat, my fingernails digging into the skin, as if I could physically pry open the passage to the world outside. The sound that escaped me was not a voice. It was a high-pitched, broken whistle, the sound of a kettle left to burn on a cold stove. I tried to stand, but the floor tilted violently. My chair toppled backward, the heavy oak frame striking the carpet, with a dull thud that seemed to echo from miles away. I was on my knees, then on my side, my cheek pressed against the plush. Expensive fibers of the rug. Every muscle in my torso strained, my diaphragm heaving in a desperate, rhythmic prayer for oxygen that would not come. Through the tunnel of my narrowing vision, I saw the hem of my sister's silk dress. She did not kneel. She did not reach out. Instead, I heard her voice, clear and cold, cutting through the sudden silence of the room like a scalpel. "See," Sloane said, her tone light, almost melodic. "She is eating mushroom soup and pretending to be allergic to crab. This year's Academy Award for Best Actress goes to Natalia Cole." A ripple of laughter, uncertain and jagged, went through the room. It was the sound of people who wanted to believe the joke, because the alternative was too terrifying to witness. I looked up at her, my lips feeling like they had been stung by 1,000 bees, my skin burning with a fire that no water could douse. I wanted to scream that I was dying, that the soup she had called a gift was a death sentence, but my tongue was a heavy, swollen anchor in a sea of rising heat. Sloane took a sip of her wine, her eyes bright with a triumphant, terrifying light. "Come on, Natalia," she continued, stepping closer so her shadow fell over my writhing form. "You can drop the act now. You have everyone's attention. Isn't that what you wanted? To make my special night all about you." The betrayal was more painful than the lack of air. It was a cold, jagged realization that my sister had not just made a mistake, she had choreographed this. She had sat there, watched me take the spoon to my lips, and waited for the show to begin. Then, the shadows shifted. Magnus Thorne did not just walk, he erupted from his seat. I heard the crash of a glass shattering, as he shoved a socialite out of his path. The air in the room seemed to crackle with his sudden, violent movement. He dropped to his knees beside me, his face a mask of grim, absolute authority. "Move," he shouted, his voice a thunderclap that silenced Sloane's laughter instantly. "Someone call 911 right now." He was already reaching into his jacket. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't hesitate. He looked at Sloane with a disgust so deep it was visceral. My sister mocked my allergy in front of guests, then handed me crab-laced soup. What she didn't see was a billionaire chief executive officer dialing 911. One with an epinephrine pen already in hand. I felt his hand on my shoulder, steady and strong. "Hold still," he whispered, his voice the only anchor I had left in a world of gray mist. "I have you. You are going to be okay." He jabbed the needle into my outer thigh, right through the expensive fabric of my dress. There was a sharp, biting sting, followed by a rush of cold fire that flooded my veins. It was the feeling of a door being kicked open in a burning house. My heart hammered with a new, frantic energy. And for the first time in an eternity, a thin, whistling thread of air reached my lungs. I was not safe, not yet. But the darkness that had been closing in at the edges of my sight began to retreat. I lay there, gasping, as the room erupted into a chaos of shouting voices and running feet. My eyes locked on the ceiling as I realized that the restorer had just become the one in need of a miracle. The adrenaline hit my system like a lightning strike, shocking my heart into a frantic gallop, like rhythm. It was a violent, chemical awakening. The crushing pressure on my windpipe eased just enough for me to drag in a thin, whistling breath of air that tasted like ozone and metallic terror. My vision, which had been reduced to a narrow, darkening tunnel, suddenly snapped back into high-definition clarity. I was still on the floor, my body trembling with the force of the epinephrine. But the mental fog had vanished. In its place was a cold, crystalline focus that I usually reserved for the most delicate restoration projects. I saw the room as a series of frozen frames. My mother was a statue of pale horror, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth. My father looked elderly for the first time in his life, his eyes darting between my prone body and his eldest daughter. And then there was Sloane. She was moving. The triumphant light in her eyes had been replaced by a frantic, twitching desperation. She leaned over the table, her silk sleeve dipping into a stray drop of sauce, as her hand reached for my soup bowl. She was trying to hide the evidence. She wanted to whisk that ceramic vessel back to the kitchen. I yelled to have the contents poured down a drain before the sirens grew any louder. She wanted to turn a murder attempt back into a simple, tragic accident. Not this time. I reached out, my fingers moving with a strength that felt borrowed from a different version of myself. I didn't grab for my throat or for the air. I lunged forward and locked my hand around Magnus Thorne's wrist. His skin was warm, his pulse steady, a stark contrast to my own icy, vibrating frame. He looked down at me, his brow furrowed in concern, but I didn't let go. I tightened my grip until my knuckles turned white, using my last ounce of physical agency to anchor him to my side. I couldn't speak. My vocal cords were too ravaged by the swelling to form words. So I used the language of my craft. I raised my free hand and pointed a trembling finger directly at the truffle soup, the amber oil still shimmering in the candlelight like a taunt. I looked Magnus in the eye and made a slow, deliberate fist, then tapped my knuckles against the floor. It was the universal signal we used in the archives for a high priority item. Preserve this. Do not move it. Do not touch it. Magnus was a man who had built an empire on his ability to read a situation in a heartbeat. He looked at the bowl, then at Sloane's outstretched hand, and finally back at me. He understood. He might not have been a restorer of books, but he was a restorer of order. No one touches that table, Magnus roared, his voice vibrating through the floorboards beneath me. Security, seal this room. 2 men in dark suits, who had been hovering at the periphery, moved with practiced efficiency. They stepped between Sloane and the table, their shadows falling over her like a shroud. She recoiled as if she had been slapped, her face going a sickly, translucent white. "Mr. Thorne," she stammered, her voice high and thin. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just trying to clear the mess for the paramedics." "Nothing leaves this room," Magnus interrupted, his tone as cold as Arctic ice. "Not a spoon, not a napkin, and certainly not that soup. This is no longer a dinner party. This is a crime scene." I lay back against the carpet, my hand finally slipping from his wrist. The sound of sirens was close now, a rising wail that promised a different kind of sanctuary. I watched the restaurant manager wringing his hands. And I watched my sister realize, in real time, that her masterpiece was unraveling. I felt a grim, silent satisfaction spread through my chest, more potent than the medicine. I had spent my life protecting fragile things from the elements, but tonight had learned how to protect myself from my own blood. As the paramedics burst through the heavy oak doors, I closed my eyes, knowing that while my body was broken, the evidence was safe in amber. The hospital room was a study in clinical white and silent, rhythmic machinery. For 2 days, the world had been reduced to the steady beep of a heart monitor and the cool flow of fluids through an intravenous line in my arm. Every time I breathed, my throat felt like it had been scrubbed with glass, a lingering reminder of the violent constriction that had nearly claimed me. I was Natalia Cole, the restorer who was now being restored, kept under observation for the cardiac strain and the threat of a secondary reaction. But as the fog of the medication lifted, my mind sharpened into a cold, hard edge. I realized I was no longer interested in being the invisible girl who blended into the background of her own life. The door to the private suite opened, and my parents walked in. They did not look like people who had spent 48 hours in the grip of paternal terror. Alistair and Cordelia were perfectly put together, their clothes pressed, and their hair immaculate, though their faces were tight with a different kind of stress. They did not come to my bedside to hold my hand. Instead, my father laid a thick manila envelope on the rolling tray table. The sound of the paper hitting the plastic surface, feeling like a physical blow. "Natalia, darling," my mother began, her voice fluttering with that high, nervous energy she used when she was about to ask for a sacrifice. "We are so relieved you are stable. Truly. But we have to think about the family. Sloane is in a terrible state. Her career, her reputation, everything she has worked for is on the line because of this misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," I croaked. The word felt like a physical weight in my mouth, my voice raspy and thin. "She watched me die." My father sighed, the sound of a man burdened by an unreasonable child. "She made a mistake, Natalia. A prank that went too far. But Magnus Thorne is threatening to involve the authorities. He has sealed the restaurant records. If this goes to court, Sloane could face prison. She could lose everything. We have prepared a non-disclosure agreement. It is for the best. We will take care of your medical bills, of course, and we can all move past this as a family." I looked at the envelope. Inside were the tools of my own erasure. My parents were not my protectors. They were Sloane's cleanup crew, more concerned with the optics of promotion than the fact that their youngest daughter had been poisoned in front of them. The lie I had lived by for 26 years. The belief that if I were just quiet enough and perfect enough, I would be loved. Dissolved in the sterile air of that room. I felt a sudden, dizzying clarity. I was the one who understood the chemistry of decay. I knew that you could not save a manuscript if the mold had already reached the core. You had to cut it out. "Please, Natalia," my mother whispered, "do not do this to your sister. Do not ruin our family." I did not answer her. Instead, I waited until they left, their footsteps echoing with a sense of entitlement that no longer had any power over me. As soon as the door clicked shut, I reached for my phone. My fingers were steady now, the tremors of the epinephrine finally gone. I did not call my parents' lawyer. I called Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis was a man who specialized in high-stakes civil litigation, a legal predator who understood that some things were beyond repair. I told him everything. I told him about the soup, the laughter, the epinephrine pen, and the manila envelope currently sitting on my bedside table. "I want her destroyed," I told him, my voice gaining strength with every syllable. Not just embarrassed. Not just inconvenienced. I want her to lose the career she values more than my life. I want my parents to understand the cost of their choices. I want you to treat Sloane like a mold-infested 14th century scroll. Remove the rot entirely, or the whole thing is lost." Mr. Lewis was silent for a moment, and then I heard the sound of a pen scratching against paper. "I understand, Natalia. What is our target?" $900,000, I said. It was a calculated number. High enough to ruin her financially, but just low enough that they would settle to avoid a jury. I was done being the silent observer. I was going to be the one to apply the acid. I leaned back against the pillows, watching the heart monitor track the steady, purposeful beat of a woman who had finally decided to save herself. I was done being a victim of the family narrative. It was time to rewrite the history of Natalia Cole. The mediation room smelled of lemon furniture polish and the metallic, biting scent of cold desperation. It was a neutral box of a room. Beige walls and oak tables designed to be the graveyard of corporate scandals and family secrets. I arrived 20 minutes early with Mr. Lewis, sitting in a leather chair that squeaked with every breath I took. My hands were folded on the table, still prone to the occasional, ghost-like tremor from the medication I would be taking for the next 6 months. I felt like a rare manuscript, placed under a heavy glass weight. Pinned down and waiting for the final assessment of my value. Sloane walked in exactly 12 minutes late. A classic power play that felt hollow in the face of what was coming. She wore a dove, gray dress of soft silk. Her hair pulled back in a chignon so perfect it looked painted on. She had opted for the innocent victim aesthetic. Her makeup subtle and her eyes wide with a carefully rehearsed shimmer of remorse. My parents flanked her like two aging gargoyles. Their faces set in grim masks of parental duty. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and a burgeoning, sharp, edged resentment, as if my refusal to die quietly had become an unbearable social inconvenience. "Natalia," my mother started, her voice a soft, manipulative trill. "Honey, we are just so glad to see you upright." I did not respond. I watched Sloane as she sat down across from me. She leaned forward, her eyes glistening with tears that I knew were as synthetic as her PR campaigns. "Natalia, I need you to know how sorry I am," Sloane said, her voice cracking with practiced precision. "I swear on my life, I only thought you would get an itchy rash. I just wanted to tease you a bit. To get you to loosen up. I didn't know it would be like this." The air in the room felt thick, as if the oxygen were being rationed again. I remembered the sensation of the carpet against my cheek and the sound of her laughter while I suffocated. "Stop," I said. The word was a jagged piece of glass, tearing through my damaged throat. My voice was raspy, a haunting echo of the woman I used to be. "Your sister made a mistake, Natalia," my father interrupted, his tone heavy with the weight of a patriarch who expected obedience. "But at the end of the day, no matter what happens, we are your only family. Family forgives. Family moves forward." I looked at him, and then at the mother who had tried to hand me a non-disclosure agreement while I was still hooked to a cardiac monitor. The final tether in my chest, the one that had kept me bound to the hope of their love, snapped with a sound only I could hear. "No," I replied. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a mountain. "I don't want a family like this. I will absolutely not let this go." Mr. Lewis chose that moment to open his briefcase. The snap of the metal locks, sounding like a gunshot in the small room. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a thick stack of documents across the table, each page a nail in the coffin of Sloane's career. "Ms. Cole, you are a public relations director," Mr. Lewis said, his voice clinical and cold. "You are a professional in the field of optics and calculated outcomes. You know the exact boundary between a prank and attempted manslaughter." "That is not, I didn't," Sloane began, her face losing its carefully managed color. "We have the toxicology reports and the sworn affidavit from Chef Bastien," Mr. Lewis continued, ignoring her. "He confirms you specifically requested the crab fat oil. We have the server Andy, who saw you personally wrecked that bowl to Natalia's seat. But most importantly, we have your digital footprint." He pulled out a final sheet of paper. It was a log of Sloane's internet search history from her personal laptop, recovered by a digital forensics specialist 3 days before the party. How much shellfish causes a reaction? Can you hide crab oil in soup? Symptoms of severe anaphylaxis. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sloane's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and my father stared at the table, as if the wood grain might offer him a way out. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a premeditated strike. A cold-blooded experiment with my life as the variable. "The district attorney's office is very interested in these logs," Mr. Lewis said, his voice dropping an octave. "Given the evidence of planning, you are looking at 8 years in a state correctional facility for aggravated assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm." Sloane began to shake, her dove, gray silk damp with sweat. "My client is willing to forego criminal prosecution," Mr. Lewis said, the door to her trap opening just a fraction of an inch, "in exchange for a civil settlement covering medical expenses." emotional distress, and punitive damages. How much? My father asked, his voice hollow. $900,000, I said. Sloane's composure shattered. That is insane. I don't have that kind of money. Nobody my age has that. You have a two-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights, Mr. Lewis recited. You have investment accounts and jewelry. Your parents have home equity and retirement funds. The alternative is prison, a permanent criminal record, and a scandal that will ensure you never work in public relations again. You get to keep your freedom and what is left of your dignity. Sloane looked at me, and for the first time she saw me. She saw the restorer who had decided that some things were beyond repair. I saw her realize that the quiet, accommodating sister was gone, replaced by someone who understood that to save the manuscript, you had to burn the rot. You can't do this, she whispered. I met her gaze, my eyes clear and unflinching. I can. And I am. My parents looked at me with a hatred that was pure and naked. The kind of loathing reserved for someone who refuses to play their assigned role in a lie. I didn't care. Their hatred was a neutral substance, unable to affect the integrity of the life I was building. It took 45 minutes of weeping, arguing, and desperate bargaining. But the math of 8 years in a cell was undeniable. Sloane's hand trembled as she put the pen to the paper, the ink bleeding into the fibers as she traded her future for her freedom. I watched the signature form, knowing that this was the final act of restoration. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of my own justice. The scratch of the pen against the settlement papers was the only sound in the room, a dry, rasping noise that felt like the final stitches being pulled through a jagged wound. I watched the ink saturate the grain of the paper as Sloane scrawled her name, her hand shaking so violently that her elegant signature looked like a line of barbed wire. My father followed, his jaw tight as he signed as a guarantor. His retirement fund and the equity of my childhood home vanishing into the ink. Then my mother, her face wet with tears that no longer moved me. When the last document was gathered by Mr. Lewis, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a structure that had finally collapsed. Sloane looked up at me, her face pale and her eyes hollowing out. The gray silk of her dress seemed to hang off her now, the image of the rising star replaced by the reality of a woman who had just been dismantled. I am your sister, she said, her voice a hollow, brittle thing that barely carried across the table. How could you take everything from me? I stood up, my knees steady for the first time in weeks. I smoothed the fabric of my coat, feeling the solid, physical reality of my own existence. You were someone who tried to kill me, I replied, the words coming out as a breathless but clear whisper. There is a difference. As I walked toward the door, my father stood up, his voice cracking with an old authority that had lost its edge. Natalia, you can walk out that door, but do not think you are coming back. You have traded your family for a pile of money. You are cold, Natalia. You are as cold as the books you spend your life with. I stopped at the threshold, my hand on the cool brass of the handle. I did not turn around. I had spent 26 years trying to warm myself at a fire that was never meant for me. I had swallowed injuries and accepted crumbs of affection while being treated as a secondary character in Sloane's life. I realized then that they were right. I was cold. I was the precision of a scalpel. I was the chemical solution that removed the filth from the page to reveal the truth beneath. You did not trade me for money, I said, looking out at the hallway. You traded me for a promotion. You traded me for optics. I am just balancing the books. I walked out of that building and into the afternoon sunlight. The air was crisp, tasting of the coming autumn, and for the first time since the night at Atoil, I drew a breath that did not hurt. Behind me, in that beige room, my mother's sobbing continued, a fading soundtrack to a life I was leaving behind. I felt a strange, dizzying sense of lightness. I was 90 days away from being completely, irrevocably free. Over the next few months, the ripples of that night turned into a tidal wave that swept Sloane's world away. The public relations firm let her go quietly, the official reason being restructuring. But the industry gossip was a wildfire. Word travels fast when it involves a rising star who tried to poison her own blood at a corporate banquet. Her Riverside Heights apartment went on the market. Her car was returned to the dealership. I received the first installment of the settlement. $100,000 that I deposited into a new account, a seed for a future they could not touch. I heard through the grapevine that Sloane had tried to pivot, attempting to use her old connections to find a new role, but the doors were locked. Even her social circle, those people who had laughed at her joke while I suffocated, had vanished. To them, she was no longer an asset. She was a liability, a toxic element that threatened to stain anyone she touched. My parents were forced to take out a second mortgage, their lives of quiet vanity replaced by the cold reality of debt. One evening, a year to the day after the poisoning, I received a final text from a former colleague of hers. Sloane had been seen at a party for an old high school friend. She had been charm personified. Wearing a borrowed dress and trying to secure a man with a penthouse in the financial district. For a few weeks, it had seemed as though she might claw her way back up. But the truth is like a stain on vellum. You can try to cover it, but the light always reveals the underlying damage. He had found out. He had seen the legal filings. He had had his security team pack her things and leave them in the lobby. Now, she was working in a telemarketing center, 4 miles from the apartment she used to own. 40 hours a week in a fluorescent, lit room, reading scripts to people who hung up on her. Every penny she made above the cost of her survival was being diverted to pay the debt she owed me. I sat in my apartment, watching the sun set over the city, and felt no joy in her ruin. I felt only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. I had preserved the most important thing of all. I had preserved myself. The toxicity had been removed. The pages were clean. I was no longer the girl who was silenced. I was the woman who had written her own ending. The warehouse in the arts district was a cathedral of quiet industry. Enormous windows stretched toward the ceiling, allowing cascading sheets of afternoon light to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air like golden snow. The space smelled of lemon oil, old leather, and the sharp, clean scent of high-grade ethanol. This was my library. This was Cole conservation and restoration. I walked along the rows of custom, built oak shelves, my fingers trailing over the spines of books that had traveled through centuries to reach my hands. Each volume was a survivor of war, fire, or neglect. And it was my job to ensure they lived another 100 years. I stopped at a heavy workstation where a 16th-century manuscript lay open, its pages brittle and foxed with age. I pulled on my white cotton gloves, the fabric of familiar, secondary skin. I felt a profound, heavy sense of peace. I was no longer a fragment of someone else's narrative. I was the master of my own. My phone buzzed on the corner of the desk. A message from Mr. Lewis. The final installment of the settlement had cleared. $900,000, paid in full over 18 months. The debt that had stripped Sloane of her Riverside Heights apartment and forced my parents into a second mortgage was finally settled. The case was officially closed. I stared at the screen for a long moment, waiting for a surge of triumph or a flicker of the old grief. Instead, there was only a vast, neutral silence. The transaction was complete. The books were balanced. Turned out, nearly dying had made me a legend in the world of high-stakes preservation. People heard the story of the restorer who had outsmarted her own murder, and they brought me their most precious treasures. Magnus Thorne had been the first, handing over his entire heritage library of 400 years of Thorne family documents. He had looked at me that day and said I was the only one he trusted because I knew the difference between what was worth saving and what needed to be cut out like a cancer. That contract alone had been the seed that allowed me to hire 2 junior conservators and buy the specialized equipment I needed. Now, my company was valued at $2,500,000. I looked at a framed photograph on the wall, the only one I kept from my former life. It was a picture of me and Sloane as children, standing in the garden of our old house. In the photo, she is leaning toward the camera, her smile already practiced and bright, while I am half hidden behind a rosebush, my eyes fixed on a book in my lap. For 26 years, I had allowed myself to be the girl in the shadows, believing that my invisibility was the price of my safety. I knew where she was now. A former colleague had mentioned it in a passing email. Sloane was working in a gray cubicle in a strip mall, selling insurance over the phone to people who did not want to talk to her. My parents were still in their mortgaged house, telling anyone who would listen that I had overreacted, that family should always forgive. Their opinions were like voices from a distant, fading country. I had emigrated from their world of vanity and gaslighting, and the border was now permanently closed. I turned back to the manuscript on my table. I picked up a fine, tipped brush and began to apply a stabilizing solution to a jagged tear in the vellum. It was slow, meticulous work. It required patience, silence, and an absolute respect for the integrity of the object. Some things could be repaired. Some things could be made stronger by the very process of their breaking. But some things, like the mold that eats through a spine, had to be removed entirely so the rest could survive. I was Natalia Cole. I was a surgeon for history. I had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to me, and I had alchemized it into a life of light and purpose. As the sun began to set, casting long, amber bars across the brick walls, I realized I was exactly where I was meant to be. The toxicity was gone. The pages were clean. The restoration was complete.